Rome, 63 AD. The sun is setting behind the palatial rooftops, and the city prepares not for rest, but for revelry. You've heard the legends, the feasts, the excess, the infamous orgies of ancient Rome. But tonight, we're going beyond the velvet curtains, behind the flickering torches, into the hidden realm where fantasies are born and managed. Because what most don't know is that these grand spectacles of sensual delight didn't happen on their own. They were crafted, curated, and controlled by a very specific kind of woman. She had no army, no title, no marble bust in her honor. And yet, every senator, every general, every whisper of Roman gossip depended on her. She was the invisible force behind the empire's greatest indulgences. She was a Roman orgy planner, and this is her world. Welcome to a day in her life. Her name was not written in any surviving scroll, but the world she built existed nonetheless. Let's call her Livia, a name common among Roman women of stature. Livia's villa stood in the shadow of Palatine Hill, not too close to draw suspicion, but near enough that her services could reach the highest echelons of Roman society. She awoke before dawn, always, not for meditation, nor devotion, but for planning. Before the roosters cried, she was already walking the tiled halls of her home, barefoot, with a tablet of wax in one hand and a stylus in the other. By lamplight, she reviewed the details of the night ahead, client names, preferences, dangerous rivalries, dietary restrictions, and scandalous requests. One senator, recently returned from Britannia, wanted to recreate a druidic love ritual, with torches, oak leaves, and chanting slaves painted in blue woad. Another noblewoman had requested an orgy of the senses themed around the 7 perfumes of Arabia. Each event was a campaign. Every night, a new war. At a glance, Livia's home looked modest, but within its marble walls lay a war room of luxury. Silk bolts from Alexandria were stacked by color and scent. Yes, scent, for fabric perfume was part of the sensory strategy. Amphorae of rare wines were labeled not by grape but by emotional effect. Warmth, relaxation, libido. Dancers from Egypt, Gaul, and Cappadocia trained in a shaded courtyard, their movements timed to specific lute melodies. A hidden pantry contained over 24 types of honey, each paired with fruits, cheeses, or meats, depending on the nature of the client's fantasy. She managed this all without theatrics, her voice rarely raised, her instructions subtle but absolute. When Livia entered a room, people moved without being told. She had learned long ago that in a world ruled by men, the sharpest form of power was one nobody saw coming. She hadn't always held such control. Her beginnings were brutal. Born to a lower-class merchant and a freedwoman, she was sold into servitude at age 11, after her father defaulted on a grain debt. Her buyer was a notorious matron of Rome's underworld, a woman who hosted intimate salons for Rome's bored elite. It was there, in the silken shadows, that Livia learned everything: how to listen, how to predict, how to disappear, how to manipulate. She observed senators whisper confessions to courtesans. She watched wives weep behind ivory fans while their husbands indulged. She realized the secret. Rome wasn't built on marble, it was built on desire. By age 17, Livia was managing her first event, a modest affair for a middle-tier magistrate celebrating a new appointment. She hired dancers dressed as Vestal virgins and trained them to slowly undress to the rhythm of a war march. The symbolism was scandalous, chaste piety giving way to martial conquest. The magistrate was thrilled. He paid double, then begged her to plan his Saturnalia celebration. That night marked her ascent. Word spread, not just of her creativity, but her ability to manage chaos, because chaos came often. At one notorious event, a client's wife showed up uninvited, disguised as a servant. She attempted to poison one of the dancers. Livia, having sensed something was off earlier in the evening, had already swapped the wine. The wife was exposed, the scandal suppressed, and the client doubled her pay. From that point forward, Livia began keeping detailed records, names, secrets, preferences, and weaknesses. A scroll hidden beneath her bed, written in code, became her shield and sword. Livia's hidden scroll grew with every night, more names, more power. It included whispers of backroom political deals made while senators lounged in lavender-scented baths. It listed who snuck off with whose slave, which wives indulged when their husbands were away, and which foreign envoys could be bribed not with coin, but with rare performers. She didn't use the scroll for vengeance. She used it for leverage. It was her protection. In a city where trust was foolish and survival depended on staying useful, she made herself irreplaceable. The day of an event was a storm in disguise. At sunrise, her villa turned into a beehive. Couriers rushed in and out, delivering flowers, fine linens, and wine barrels sealed with imperial wax. Musicians arrived to rehearse. Their instruments, guitars, flutes, lyres, tuned to a specific sequence she'd mapped out hour by hour. Dancers warmed up in the courtyard while stylists rubbed oils infused with saffron and myrrh into their skin. Livia moved among them silently, adjusting a veil here, repositioning a table there. Her presence didn't scream, it whispered, and everyone listened. One of her most famous events, later whispered about in patrician baths and brothels alike, was called the Banquet of Shadows. The client was a retired general known for his brutality in Germania. He wanted something dark, strange, and unforgettable. Livia designed an evening held entirely by torchlight in a villa painted black for the occasion. Every guest was cloaked in darkness and mystery. Dancers moved like ghosts. Wines were dyed with squid ink and served in black glass. Performers emerged from behind hidden doors and performed erotic tragedies in silence, illuminated only by flickering flame. By the end of the night, half the guests were crying, not out of pain, but from the overwhelming sensory experience. The general declared it more haunting than war, and Livia became legend. But not all nights were grand spectacles. Some required subtlety. A senator's timid son wanted to explore his desires discreetly. Livia arranged a garden of dreams in a quiet orchard, filled with perfumed cushions, gentle harpists, and performers who read love poetry between moments of intimacy. The boy left transformed, not humiliated, but empowered. Months later, his father secretly sent her a bag of emeralds as thanks for helping his son become a man. That was Livia's real gift, understanding not just what her clients said, but what they couldn't say. She kept her team small and loyal. A mute Egyptian cook who could prepare aphrodisiac feasts with surgical precision. A former gladiator turned doorman who could both charm and intimidate guests as needed. A Gallic twin who specialized in mimicry and served as both entertainer and spy. Livia paid them better than most senators paid their scribes. She didn't rule with fear, she ruled with purpose. Every member of her staff knew if Livia fell, they all fell. But under her rule, they thrived. One day, a message arrived bearing the imperial sail. Emperor Nero, infamous for his tastes, requested her services, not just for an event, but for a personal night of divine madness. The stakes had never been higher. Refusing was dangerous. Accepting could be fatal if it went wrong. She agreed. The imperial villa was unlike anything she'd worked in. Gilded ceilings, floors inlaid with tiger bone, fountains that ran with wine. But it was hollow. Nero's madness filled the air like smoke. He demanded theatrics. He wanted gods to descend, for stars to fall, for pleasure to reach apocalyptic heights. Livia delivered. She built a rotating stage, mimicking the heavens. She employed actors dressed as deities, wired with hidden pulleys and incense tubes. The evening culminated in Nero declaring himself Jupiter reborn. He stood naked atop a marble column while guests howled with drunken awe. It was madness, but it worked. Nero gifted her a sapphire ring the next morning and told her, "Even the gods envy your imagination." She didn't wear the ring. She sold it. With the proceeds, she bought property on the outskirts of the Aventine Hill. A second villa, a fallback, because Livia always prepared for when the torchlight turned against her. The second villa was discreet. No grand columns, no bronze statues, just olive trees, a sunken garden, and enough distance from the city's gossip to keep her name safe. She called it her silent sanctuary, though it never stayed silent for long. Even there, clients found her. Some arrived in plain tunics under cover of night. Others sent messengers ahead of their littered processions, offering outrageous sums for just one evening of her work. Livia didn't accept them all. She was no longer desperate to please. Now she curated her clients like an artist choosing colors, carefully, intentionally. Her events had become rarer, more mythical, and that only made them more valuable. Still, danger was always close. A rival planner, a former prostitute named Delia, who catered to Rome's younger elite, began to undercut her rates. Delia's parties were louder, riskier, and often involved narcotics imported from Parthia. For a time, senators flocked to her, but then a scandal struck. A slave girl overdosed mid-feast. The senator who hosted the event was nearly exiled. Delia vanished. Some said she was silenced by the Praetorian Guard. Others whispered that Livia had warned her privately once, then let fate decide. Regardless, Livia's name emerged cleaner, her services once again in high demand. But even as her influence grew, Livia began to tire. Not of the work, but of what it took from her. She had sacrificed companionship, motherhood, even identity. She had lived through decades of empire, seen emperors rise and fall, watched friends dragged into exile for nothing more than a careless phrase uttered in a drunken moment. She remained, always calculating, always neutral. But inside, something softened. She began spending more time walking her gardens alone, listening to the birds instead of lyres. She read poetry. She allowed herself to feel something like longing. Then came the night she called her final masterpiece. It was commissioned by a wealthy foreign diplomat who wanted to impress the Roman elite, perhaps by favor. Livia knew it would be her last event. She named it The Fall of Innocence. It took place in a borrowed villa just outside Rome, reimagined as a mythic forest. Ivy crept up marble pillars. Musicians hid in trees, playing invisible music. Servants dressed as woodland spirits offered food and wine laced with fig nectar. Performers reenacted the fall of Icarus, the seduction of Europa, and the binding of Prometheus, all rewritten as metaphors for human craving. Guests entered clothed, they left transformed. One senator wept openly, cradling a silver mask in his hands. Another tried to buy the villa outright. After that night, Livia vanished. She didn't announce retirement. She didn't host her farewell. She simply stopped. Her staff was paid off, her properties placed in the care of trusted allies. Rumors swirled. Some said she was poisoned by a jealous noblewoman. Others claimed she sailed east to start a temple of pleasure in Crete. A few believed she remained in Rome, living quietly among the poor, wearing simple robes and smiling to herself when others spoke her name. But her legacy lingered like perfume on silk. New planners emerged, imitating her style, whispering her techniques like gospel. Her name became shorthand for control, for mystery, for perfection. And in every gathering, every torchlit orgy where laughter turned to gasps and gasps to silence, there was a little bit of Livia. Her timing, her orchestration, her unseen hand guiding the chaos. And in the shadows of Rome, where senators still whispered secrets and lovers still sought escape from the weight of duty, her scroll remained, somewhere hidden and untouched. A record not of history, but of the desires that shaped it. Years passed. New names dominated the streets of Rome. Emperors changed, philosophies shifted, but one thing remained constant: desire, and with it the need for someone who could orchestrate that desire without letting it consume those who indulged in it. Though Livia had vanished, Her story continued through whispered legends and half-true recollections from old senators who remembered their best nights with wistful eyes and smirking lips. One such senator, long retired and half-blind, once hosted an event in her style as a tribute. He called it the Ghost of Livia. It was a pale imitation. The dancers were uncoordinated, the wine too bitter, the music too loud. But guests came anyway, just for a chance to say they were part of something connected to her. They passed around stories like relics, that she had once convinced an assassin to spare a consul's life by offering him a night with 3 twin sisters trained in both poetry and swordplay, that she once used a secret tunnel beneath the temple of Minerva to smuggle out a scandalized nobleman before his wife arrived with armed guards, that she could break a man's heart without touching him. Were any of them true? It didn't matter. Myth in Rome was often more powerful than memory. Meanwhile, in the southern countryside, a villa remained well kept despite its mistress's absence. Olive trees were trimmed. A garden of white flowers bloomed year-round. Locals said a veiled woman came every new moon to tend the place. She never spoke, never stayed long. Children were warned not to follow her, not out of fear, but reverence. They called her Domina Umbrae, the Lady of Shadows. And while the empire expanded, pushing into distant lands, claiming new territories, the culture within shifted. With time, Rome's parties became more public, more performative. Gone was the intimacy of the older, curated gatherings. What once relied on subtlety was now executed with gaudy theatrics. Gold masks, blood sport, and drug-fueled chaos replaced the carefully layered sensuality that Livia had perfected. Pleasure was no longer worshipped, it was consumed. Still, some refused to forget. A young woman named Marcia, raised by a former servant of Livia's household, discovered the old scroll, coded, hidden behind a false wall in the silent villa. She couldn't read all of it, but what she did read changed her life. Names, events, symbols, techniques. She studied it, reconstructed what she could, and slowly, in secret, she began hosting her own gatherings, smaller, more elegant. Invitations were carved on ivory. Guests were chosen not for their power, but their intention. The experience mattered more than the... Within months, the whispers began again. There is one who knows the old ways. She serves honeyed figs in silver leaves. She doesn't smile, but she makes you feel seen. Marcia never claimed to be Livia's heir. She let the guests draw their own conclusions. And in the world of Roman pleasure, mystery always commanded more devotion than truth. Livia's influence, therefore, never died. It evolved. It embedded itself in Rome's psyche, in the way people lowered their voices when they spoke of certain nights, in how hosts checked candlelight just before the first guest arrived, in the tension of a paused flute note, in the scent of warmed myrrh drifting through an open colonnade. Wherever elegance touched desire, she was there. Eventually, the empire cracked. Rome burned, rebuilt, fractured again. But fragments of her legacy appeared even centuries later, in the love poems of a Christian monk, describing dreams he dare not speak aloud, in Byzantine tapestries that hinted at unseen festivals, in coded recipes describing how to awaken the heart through sweetness and fire. She became more than a woman. She became a symbol. And yet, some say she truly never left, that on certain nights, if a gathering is just right, if the wine is aged, the silk scented, the candles steady, you might feel her presence, not as a ghost, but as a gentle shift in the air, as if the room itself exhales, as if time slows for a breath, as if Livia, wherever she is, has noticed and approves. As centuries turned, Rome changed. Its gods faded, its emperors died, its banners replaced by those of the church. But still, in private spaces, where candlelight flickered and secrets were exchanged with wine-stained lips, Traces of Livia's craft endured. Her blueprint wasn't etched in stone, but in behavior. Every time a host paused before a performance to let anticipation build, every time a guest whispered their desires without shame, every time music was timed perfectly with emotion, Livia's legacy lived again. In the eastern provinces, where Roman rule stretched like a whisper over desert cities and Hellenistic temples, scholars uncovered letters between early merchants and court dancers. These letters detailed the method of shadowed delight, a style of orchestration focused not on indulgence alone, but on memory. One dancer wrote, "We do not simply entertain them, we shape the dreams they'll carry into the next life." That was Livia's true gift. She understood that an evening of pleasure could outlast empires if woven into memory with enough care. But pleasure, in her world, was never aimless. Every scent, every note of music, every gesture was purposeful. She didn't deal in lust. She dealt in transformation. One event could change a guest's ambition, weaken their resistance, heighten their perception of another, or allow them to see themselves for the first time. Her work was emotional architecture, and her material was human desire. Of course, not all who attempted to carry her flame were successful. Many imitators misunderstood the point. They focused on the spectacle. Too much gold, too many slaves, too little soul. They brought in jugglers and fire breathers and called it a celebration, but the guests left unfulfilled. Livia had known that true indulgence required restraint, that silence was sometimes more seductive than sound, that leaving one candle unlit, one fruit untouched, could make an experience linger longer in the mind. In Alexandria, centuries later, a philosopher queen supposedly reconstructed one of Livia's infamous performances from surviving fragments. Her scrolls describe a gathering where guests were blindfolded at the gates and guided through perfumed gardens barefoot before entering the feast. The idea wasn't to confuse, it was to heighten awareness, to shift the mind from routine into wonder. There were no overt sexual performances, no excess, just tension, intimacy, laughter and melancholy wrapped together like vines. The feast lasted from sunset until sunrise, and when dawn broke, the guests knelt, not to pray, but to breathe. Livia had unlocked something timeless, the hunger beneath pleasure. She gave people what they didn't know they needed, and for that, her name, though unofficial, survived on every whisper of lips that longed for more. And then something remarkable happened. In the ruins of an old Roman villa uncovered near Capua, archaeologists found fragments of a wax tablet. Most of it had faded, but a few legible lines remained, coded, rhythmic references to light, order, masks, and silence. There was no signature, but one word, Domina, was carved deeper than the rest. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others saw it as confirmation that Livia's scroll had survived, or at least pieces of it had. Modern historians debate whether Livia ever truly existed. Some say she was a composite of several women. Others argue she was an invention of elite men, a ghost they blamed or credited, depending on the outcome of their own indulgences. But her details are too consistent, her echoes too deliberate to dismiss. In the stories of courtesans, the ledgers of wine merchants, the margins of love poetry, she appears again and again. An unnamed force, a planner, a goddess in the guise of a servant. And perhaps that was her ultimate masterpiece, to vanish from history while remaining everywhere within it. Far beyond the walls of Rome, across the empire's ever-shifting borders, the influence of curated pleasure didn't fade, it adapted. In Gaul, upper-class villas mimicked Roman indulgence with their own twists. Feasts blended with druidic rituals, forested temples lit with amber torches, and horn music echoing under open skies. In these places, planners inspired by the Roman mold arose, not only as entertainers, but as spiritual guides. They studied the scrolls, fragments, and gossip that hinted at Livia's principles. They learned that decadence wasn't just wealth. It was emotional tension, narrative timing, the ability to take a powerful man and make him feel like a whisper. The few who truly understood this began to call themselves shapers, not priests, not concubines, but something in between. One woman, Aurelia of Lugdunum, left behind letters to her daughter detailing the practices she'd refined after years of working Roman-style gatherings deep in the provinces. She advised, begin each feast with silence, so the first sound becomes sacred. Arrange the lighting so faces reveal slowly, like secrets. And always have a moment that no one expects, a guest's forgotten memory awakened, a scent from childhood, a song that stops everyone. It was in these regions that a new role emerged. Descendants of the Roman orgy planner who saw themselves as keepers of emotional order during chaotic times. They used Livia's methods not for politics or survival, but for preservation. When the empire began to crumble, these gatherings often became the only place where cultures met without swords. A Syrian merchant might recite love poetry beside a Gothic mercenary, both disarmed by honeyed wine and harp chords. Here, seduction became diplomacy, the planner's role to make space for peace through pleasure. But as Christianity rose, the old ways were hunted. Sensual gatherings were rebranded as sin. What had once been sacred was now considered shameful. Pleasure became dangerous. Shapers disappeared. Scrolls were burned, and yet even this could not fully erase Livia's shadow. In underground spaces, protected by wealthy patrons who defied the church in secret, the work continued. Events became coded, invitations disguised as prayer requests, songs written with double meanings, rituals transformed into theater. In the great cities, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, secret chambers pulsed with incense, rhythm, and human intimacy. And behind it all, the same principles remained. Timing, intention. Livia had never claimed to be a philosopher. Yet scholars of the New Age began treating her methods as a kind of emotional science. In the first preserved medieval writings on aesthetics, a monk named Petrus writes of the unseen architect of vice who moves hearts more deeply than sermons. He likely never knew her name, but his phrasing echoes a line scratched in the ruins of a Roman bath. The planner holds the night together like wine in glass. Centuries passed, marble crumbled, languages changed, but still her essence persisted. Wherever a host adjusted the lighting for mood, wherever music paused just long enough for silence to make someone ache, Livia lived. Eventually, the Renaissance unearthed pieces of the ancient world. Columns, art, philosophy, but not all of it was visible. In the manuscripts and salons of Venice, whispers returned about Roman sensualists and their methods. A painter's muse posed in a scene that mirrored one of Livia's old events. A theatre producer in Florence staged a banquet of gods strikingly similar to her imperial feast for Nero. Her techniques had outlived her name. And that is how true legacy works. It is not a statue or a coin. It is not a scroll or a throne. It is the ripple, the after-image, the unnamed influence that survives not through credit, but through repetition. Long before algorithms, before stages and spotlights, before anyone spoke of entertainment as an industry, there was the art of seduction through space, through scent, sound, sequence. Livia's genius had never been in indulgence alone, it was in modulation. She treated every night like a symphony. Not every moment was meant to arouse, some were designed to rest, others to provoke reflection. Her greatest skill was knowing what her guests needed before they did. This art would eventually be adopted, though misunderstood, by courts throughout Europe. In 17th century France, when Versailles held secret salons under the Sun King, the structure of those nights echoed the shadowed villas of ancient Rome. Champagne was poured not only to intoxicate, but to encourage conversation. Dances became rituals of power and submission. Behind every fan flutter or piano note, there were layers, many of which could be traced to women like Livia. And yet, as society modernized, the planners, those who orchestrated the emotional rhythm of nights, faded again into the background. Their contributions, like Livia's, were rarely recorded. Power still preferred names etched in marble, not those whispered between silk sheets at midnight. But something changed in the 19th century when scholars rediscovered the darker, sensual side of ancient Rome. Among their findings were private letters, rare erotic frescoes, and fragments of performance records from elite Roman households. These confirmed what many had suspected: that pleasure in Rome had not been spontaneous chaos. It had been planned, directed, measured by someone. Often a woman, always someone behind the curtain. Inspired, novelists of the Romantic era began crafting stories around such figures, mysterious women who ruled from the shadows. Though fictionalized, these characters bore uncanny resemblance to Livia. Cool, elegant, dangerous, capable of commanding empires with nothing but scent, music, and memory. She became an archetype. Not the courtesan, not the seductress, but the architect of desire. In the 20th century, as cinema emerged and directors explored decadence on screen, Livia's spirit returned once more, though she still went unnamed. In every grand party scene, in every mysterious hostess who seems to control the very air, in every moment of tension where a single look halts a crowded room, Livia lives. Not as a character, but as a formula, a sensibility, a rhythm. And today, even in digital spaces, echoes of her methods thrive. Event planners, intimacy coaches, even designers of immersive theater unknowingly replicate her core principles. Understand your guests, control the sequence, reveal slowly, make them feel seen. Livia may have lived in marble halls, but her spirit lives in mood lighting, in curated playlists, in the moment someone steps into a space and feels something shift before they know why. She may never trend on history's timelines, but in the deep current beneath our social rituals, she flows on. And yet, the question remains, who was she really? Was she a freedwoman who rose through Rome's shadows, a noblewoman disillusioned by marriage, an orphan taught to survive by pleasing others? Perhaps she was all of these. Perhaps she was none, because in the end, Livia was less a person and more a role, one that history demands again and again in every society that craves freedom behind closed doors. Some believe Livia's legacy belongs in the realm of myth. After all, what is history but stories that gained power over time? But even myths have roots. Somewhere, somehow, someone planned that first unforgettable night, not the wild, drunken chaos of the streets, but the kind where hearts were laid bare, where masks slipped, and where every sigh, every candle, every stolen glance followed a pattern only the planner knew. And that woman, whoever she truly was, started something. She started a lineage not of blood, but of knowledge. A tradition passed not through names, but through instinct, through the knowing glance of a host who reads the room without speaking, through the placement of one perfectly timed silence between songs, through the moment an anxious guest finally breathes easy and forgets the weight of their public face. She started a kind of magic. Livia's magic wasn't spells or rituals. It was the manipulation of atmosphere. She knew that people were not drawn to events, they were drawn to transformation. They came to her parties to forget the empire outside, to become animals, gods, strangers, lovers, to escape for a few hours the crushing marble of Rome's expectations, and she gave that to them. Not through chaos, but control. A master conductor in a world of fire and silk. Even today we feel it. The best events, the ones we talk about years later, aren't the loudest or the most expensive. They're the ones where we felt changed, where time bent, where everything felt choreographed yet organic. That's Livia's fingerprint. You've known it without knowing her name. You felt it in velvet lounges, in candlelit dinners where the food arrived just as you grew hungry, in music that seemed to rise with your breath. And maybe that's the only immortality worth having. Because even though her name was buried by centuries of smoke, stone, and shame, her art survived. Livia taught us that pleasure is sacred but not simple, that seduction requires architecture, that human desire, when treated with reverence, can be molded into something beautiful, even healing, and that the most powerful people in the room are often not the ones on stage, but the ones pulling the strings behind the curtain, unseen, calm, watching everything. So if tonight, in your own life, you plan something, an encounter, a moment, a dinner, even a conversation, pause. Ask yourself, what would Livia do? She'd lower the lights, adjust the scent, time the silence, and let the night unfold like poetry. Because to plan is to care, to anticipate is to love, and to craft an experience so vivid it leaves an imprint on the soul, that is the true art. If you've stayed with this story this long, perhaps you are more like her than you think. As Livia's story continued to be whispered, reshaped and reinterpreted, it ceased to be about a single woman and became something much more profound. She became a symbol, not merely of pleasure, but of mastery, of control in a world that often left women voiceless, of influence without needing a title, of elegance that didn't scream but seduced with silence. Her legacy wasn't carved in stone because it never needed to be. It was carried in gestures, passed from hand, to lover, to hostess. Her tale offered something few historical figures ever do, not a model of dominance or conquest, but a model of orchestration. She taught that the greatest form of power is not the ability to speak, but the ability to make others feel, to guide emotion, the way a sculptor guides clay, not through force, but finesse, not through rule, but rhythm. In modern times, we often confuse pleasure with noise, bright lights, louder music, faster beats, but Livia knew that anticipation was its own form of ecstasy, that a pause before a kiss, a glance held one heartbeat too long, or the subtle tilt of a wrist could electrify more than 1,000 words. And in that understanding, she found a kind of wisdom that feels ageless. And so, she became something more than human. More than legend, she became a ritual. Some circles today, secretive and elite, still claim to follow the Codex of Livia. Whether such a document truly exists or is a clever marketing fiction, no one knows. What matters is that the idea of her has survived, that her name still invokes curiosity, a sense of mystique, a hunger to know more. That's no small feat in a world that forgets so easily. There's a story, possibly invented, of a certain art collector in Vienna who keeps a single object locked away in a temperature-controlled chamber. A silver ring, faceted with a deep sapphire, said to have been a gift from Emperor Nero himself. The collector refuses to display it. He claims it belonged to the woman who planned Rome's greatest temptations. No other details are offered, but those who have glimpsed it say the sapphire seems to flicker like fire under moonlight, and that it rests on a pillow of silk so fine it must have been spun in the East. Whether that ring belonged to Livia or not, whether she even wore it, the point remains, her influence survives in artifacts, in anecdotes, in style, and most hauntingly, in instinct. Even people who've never heard her name often act in her image when they prepare a night to remember. They dim the lights, lower the voice, think not only of what will happen, but of what will linger after it's over. Because that is the gift she left behind, the ability to leave echoes. Not everyone can be powerful, not everyone can be famous, but anyone can craft a moment so intoxicating it lives forever in the mind of another. That was Livia's mission. Not domination, not submission, but remembrance. To be unforgettable, even in absence. And in that she succeeded beyond measure. In the end, all stories fade, empires fall, villas crumble, and names get washed away like footprints in the atrium dust. But Livia's story, though made of whispers, shadows, and silk, is still alive. Not because she ruled armies, but because she ruled moments. And moments, when crafted just right, become eternal. She may have planned nights of unthinkable luxury, of forbidden delight, of scandal and spectacle, but she did it not for the excess. She did it because she understood something most of Rome never did. That people crave transformation more than pleasure. That a truly unforgettable night isn't about how much wine is poured or how much gold is spent, but about how deeply someone feels. And if even one guest left her gatherings changed, stirred, cracked open in some unseen way, then her work was complete. Her absence taught just as much as her presence, for after she vanished, Rome searched for her in every new planner, every new feast. They tried to replicate the sensation she left behind, but often failed because they were chasing her results, not her philosophy. They saw the dancers, not the rhythm. They copied the layout, but forgot the feeling. Livia's world reminds us that the unseen hand is sometimes the most powerful, that silence can say more than speeches, that carefully arranged chaos can reveal a person's truth, and that real intimacy isn't loud. It's layered, patient, timed. So maybe the next time you step into a room, you'll notice the temperature shift, the way the candles flicker just so, the scent of oil warming on skin, the music playing low enough that you have to lean in. And just maybe, you'll realize someone planned that moment, crafted it, gave it meaning. And if that someone knew what they were doing, then somewhere in the folds of their thinking, in the curl of their smile, in the arc of that unfolding moment, you'll find her. The Domina Umbrae, the mistress of shadows, the woman who once shaped Rome without ever needing to shout her name. She was never just a planner of orgies. That title is far too small. She was a weaver of emotion, a cartographer of the heart, a composer of the night. And though her body turned to dust long ago, her art lives on. In every unforgettable evening, in every perfectly timed whisper, in every unexplainable moment when time itself bends under candlelight. So, if you've stayed with this story, you're now part of it. Tell someone, recreate a feeling, light a candle like she would, shape a moment that echoes. Because if Livia taught us anything, it's this. Pleasure fades, but presence becomes legend.